valued viewers. I hope you're all doing very well. The Mason Machine Works was founded in 1842 by William Mason of Taunton, Massachusetts. Mason built stationary engines, locomotives, and cotton machinery. Mason's innovative locomotive designs quickly drew praise from railroad engineers and operators and were known to be the easiest engines to repair. The company constructed 754 steam locomotives between 1853 and 1889. However, after Mason's death in 1883, the firm concentrated on its core business of textile machinery. Although his plant produced many well-known conventional locomotives, he is often better known for his adaptation of the Fairley-style articulated locomotive, which became known as the Mason Bogie, or double-truck locomotive. His design placed the driving wheels on an articulated frame under the boiler that allowed it to swivel on sharp curves. The fuel and water tender was on the engine's main frame, carried by a six-wheeled truck. The South Park purchased 23 of the 147 bogie locomotives built by the Mason. The Forney locomotive looked similar, but most of Forney's were not articulated. The Mason Bogie was the most famous, yet least successful innovation of the Mason Works. Their artistry and architecture became the crowning achievement of the Mason Works, and it is perhaps for that reason that these otherwise obscure but beautiful locomotives are remembered. The flexible bogie locomotive concept was not from William Mason himself, but came from the Scottish engineer Robert Fairley during the late 1860s. The Mason Bogie became the primary type of locomotive to be outshopped from the Mason Works through the 1870s and early 1880s. So between those 1853 and 1883 years, Mason built some of the most stunningly beautiful locomotives in the United States, completing 700 by the year of his death. He was innovative and rarely took accepted design philosophy at face value. Above all, he believed his locomotives should be beautiful, and there is no doubt his were the most beautiful and refined machines of their time. His drive to remove undesirable clutter from the clean lines of a locomotive brought about many innovations in locomotive architecture. He was the first to use horizontal cylinders on the long-frame locomotives such as the 440. To avoid the ungainly asymmetric appearance of counterweighted wheels, he used the hollow cast iron spokes and pouring lead into the voids to counterweight. And maybe Mason's most famous contribution was the adoption of the Walschaerts valve gear, the first in the United States, used on one of his Mason bogies in 1874. With Mason's entry into locomotive design came some notable changes to the locomotive form and decoration, which became a virtual architectural standard in locomotive design by the 1870s. This was the period of industrial artistry, where buildings as well as machinery were highly appointed and coordination of form, color, and decoration was paramount. During the 1800s, America was in the grip of yet another classical revival period, influencing architectural form, machinery, and locomotive design. Mason translated classical concepts into locomotive architecture. The most notable element to come from the Mason Works in the mid-1850s was the development of the ringed or fluted dome. This became one of the most recognized elements of U.S. locomotive design, with almost all U.S. builders adopting their own version by the 1870s. The fluted dome itself was essentially inspired by classical column elements from the base and head of columns from the Doric order. Other architectural features also adorned U.S. locomotives, including cabs and arched windows set to a classical proportion and steam chests corniced in classical form. The South Park Masons are probably the most well-known of all Mason bogie locomotives ever built. The line will own the second largest fleet of bogie locos at 23 between 1878 and 1880. The largest fleet of Mason locomotives, however, was managed by the Boston, Revere, Beach and Lynn Railroads in Massachusetts. The bogie locomotive concept slowly faded after Mason's death in 1883. While the Mason bogie is little more than a decorative footnote in the history of locomotive designs, the concepts did not die with it. In the years that followed, the virtues that Mason considered mandatory in locomotive design resurfaced in the Meyer locomotive, Garrett locomotive, and articulated Mallet locomotives, and today, virtually every electric and diesel locomotive is a twin truck design carrying the entire weight of the locomotive, ensuring that all of its weight, including fuel loads, contributes to operational efficiency. Upon the passing of William Mason in 1883, Friend and locomotive authority M.N. Forney wrote, "He was a wonderfully ingenious man, and combined with his ingenuity, a high order of artistic sense, so that his work was always most exquisitely designed. It might be said of his locomotives that they are melodies cast and wrought in metal." So as mentioned earlier, the South Park, Denver, and Pacific were the most popular of the Mason Bogies to exist. And the first South Park bogie locomotive of 1878 was their number 3, or the Oro City. And that was built as an 066T of almost identical design to the North Pacific Coast Bully Boy locomotive. The grades and sharp curves of the South Park line were hard on the little engine, and flange wear to the lead driver was again of concern. Mason, having done all he could on the bogie design to lift the cylinder weight off the lead axle and reduce friction on the truck pivot, chose to add a pilot truck. This was designed to lead the drive wheels into the curves and reduce flange wear. The first 266T engine built was the South Park's number 4 San Juan of late 1878. With the shipment of San Juan came also an additional pilot truck for the Oro City. The South Park then set about converting Oro City to a 266T. All of the remaining South Park bogies built were of 266T and or 286T configurations. In 1880, the ownership of the South Park, Denver, and Pacific Railroad transferred to the giant Union Pacific Railroad. For the first few years that followed, new locomotives were ordered from Baldwin's, Brooks, and Cook, with the engines supplied in builders' factory schemes. By 1885, however, the Union Pacific, having control of many and varied lines across the West, decided to standardize their schemes for efficiency. Locomotives at that point were repainted to black to the company's new standard. This included removing locomotive names and using only numbers, and in the case of the Union Pacific Standard, the same number stencil size was used on all locomotives regardless of location. Of the 286T types, 4 of these Mason bogies were built for the Denver, South Park, and Pacific Railroad, and their names were the number 25 Alpine, the number 26 Rico, the number 27 Roaring Fork, and the number 28 Denver. The Boston, Revere Beach, and Lynn Railroad almost exclusively used Mason bogies and continued to order bogie types after Mason ceased locomotive production in 1890. Copies were built first by the Taunton Locomotive Manufacturing Company, then by Manchester Locomotive Works, and finally by the American Locomotive Company. These were taken out of service when electrification was complete in 1928, except for 2 engines, which were retained for snow fighting and work trains. As it turned out, snow fighting was found to be a considerable strength for the Mason bogies. F.G. Brownell and the Burlington and Lemoyne found that their Mansfield locomotive could free itself from snowdrifts higher than the cab with minimum issue. And there was a superficially similar design to the Mason bogie, and that was the Forney locomotive. Like the Mason bogie, the Forney had powered axles under the boiler and a trailing truck under the rear bunker and tank behind the cab. However, the Forney's driving wheels are fixed in the frame rather than articulated. They were reasonably popular, particularly on elevated railroads. And today, only one Mason bogie survives, and that's called the Torch Lake, and it resides at the Greenfield Village, which is part of the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. And it's a standard gauge 064. It was built in 1873 and still hauls passengers during the summer months. And with that, the following specifications apply to the Mason Bogie 286T of the South Park, Denver, and Pacific Railroad. There were a total of 4 locomotives built, and of course the builder was William Mason. They were built in 1880, and they used Walschaerts valve gears, as I mentioned, the first to do so. The axle load of the locomotives are unknown. The weight on the drivers was 50,950 pounds. The engine weight itself was 59,255 pounds. The tender loaded weight was 38,900 pounds. The total engine and tender weights combined was 98,155 pounds. The tender water capacity was 1,795 U.S. gallons. The tender's fuel capacity was coal at 6 tons. The driver diameter was 38 inches. The boiler pressure was 140 psi. The high-pressure cylinders were 15 by 20 inches. The tractive effort was 14,092 pounds. The factor of adhesion weight on the driver's tractive effort was 3.62. The firebox area total was unknown, but the grate area square feet was 15.40 feet. And as mentioned previously, these were narrow gauge locomotives operating on 3-foot narrow gauge track. And with that, I shall wrap up this video. If you enjoyed the content today, please leave a like. And also, if you've not subscribed, please hit the subscribe button, as the like and subscribe buttons help the channel grow immensely. And a quick reminder to hit the super thanks button if you want to contribute to the channel's efforts. That would be greatly appreciated. And also, if you don't want to contribute that way, you can visit our print shop at Nickel Plate Limited on Etsy.com. And we thank you once again.